Right, well, good evening, everybody. We will kick off. I know some people are still joining, but we've got a lot to get through. So welcome to this webinar of the Community Planning Alliance on what happens after a planning application. I was hoping I could get to my next slide, but that's not working. What happens after planning permission is granted, because your campaign does not stop at that point, or may not stop. So we've got tonight an introduction by Simon Thomas, who is a committee member of the Community Planning Alliance and a long-standing campaigner, a parish councillor down in Hampshire. He'll be chairing the event. We will be following his introduction with a case study up in Sheffield. Many of you will know of Claire Baker and her success at Owlthorpe Fields, but also there's one planning permission that was granted, and there have been numerous issues following on from that, which Claire has been dealing with. We'll then be hearing from Daniel Fulton, who you may know better as Fuse Lane Consortium based in Cambridgeshire. He'll be talking about the host of issues around Northstone Newtown. If you have any questions, could you either put them in the chat, it's probably the easiest place to put them, or raise your hand at the end, and we'll take all questions at the end. And we'll be monitoring the chat. And as Marge said, please keep your cameras off throughout and stay on mute unless you're a speaker. So with no further ado, I will hand over to Simon to chair the event. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you very much, Rosie, and hello, everybody. Could I just ask Paulina Lewis to shut off your camera if you'd be kind enough, please? And let's get going. So absolutely delighted to welcome Claire and Daniel this evening, or late afternoon. This session will last for an hour. Both of the speakers will just give a very brief description of what who they are, but what they've done, which is most important. And the key of this session, as advertised, is it's all about what to do when the permission's granted, because so many of us discover that actually the battle doesn't stop there, and our developers and councils are often very lax in what they do in terms of follow-up. But both Claire and Daniel have had fantastic results in following through, and I hope that what we aim to do today is, by the end of the session, having taken some of your questions afterwards, is begin to make you understand there's an enormous amount that you can do, but you know where to need to go, and you need to know what to ask and what to say. So without further ado, and please put your questions into the chat. They will be moderated by Marge and Rosie, and we'll get round to them. The running order: Claire will start, and then I'll move to Daniel after that, and then we'll move to the Q&A. So Claire, if you'd like to briefly introduce yourself and just give a background to your particular issues and related to that, we can then move forward. So over to you, Claire.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks, Rosie. And hopefully this will be a useful event for everybody. So I'm Claire Baker, chair of Owlthorpe Fields Action Group. We've been a group together now since about 2018. We were formed to stop development on Owlthorpe Fields. There were 3 plots, and the first plot was put up for sale, and we fought hard to save it. And with a very quick summary, it went to planning committee in June 2020, where the council refused permission. The developer appealed. It went to the planning inspectorate, who granted permission on appeal in March 2021. The work started in September last year, and I can tell you that it's been going on since, and nobody has moved in yet. So all the issues that we raised during the planning inquiry and during the planning permission, where the planning committee have all come true. Anyway, so what have we been doing? We didn't stop as soon as we won the planning committee, and we thought we'd won and saved the fields. We knew that the developer would appeal, so we spent a lot of time collecting evidence on the site. That didn't work for this particular site, but in the last couple of weeks we have learned that we've saved the other 2 sites due to the evidence we've collected, and we've proven that the sites have value, and we've managed to get a woodland designated as ancient, which borders this development site, and we've got local wildlife sites bordering it. So we've really been on top of the developer right from day one, making sure that they adhere to all the planning conditions, which they haven't, I have to tell you. And we've been negotiating with the council and our MP, and they've had an enforcement notice put on them, and we're basically just holding them to account. But what I want to get over to today is that there are a lot of agencies other than the council that can help you if you're having issues, and sometimes actually those agencies are better to go to direct than going to the council. So for instance, the Environment Agency, the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, the Coal Authority, you know, for people in coal areas, so Barnsley, Sheffield areas, you know, there's things that you can do and be aware of with the, you know, with these agencies, and the same with highways, and obviously there's planning enforcement at the council, who have actually been very supportive of us. And if there's one thing I can say to you is, evidence is key. You know, take photographs and send it to council, and we always set out to be polite and be respectful, because that's how we would want to be treated, and I would say that has held us in good you know, good stead. So that's a very brief summary of Owlthorpe Fields. Simon?
Yeah, I'm back, Claire. You got me by surprise.
Sorry, should I have talked for longer?
I did say you weren't going to be 10 minutes. No. Before moving to Daniel, if I can just ask you a few questions that maybe some of the audience might. So how many dwellings are you talking about in total, and how many during this first phase?
So there was going to be 3 phases, 72 on this first phase, and then similar numbers on the other 2 phases.
Okay. So just over 200 dwellings, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. What I loved was when you said the issues came true, that you'd actually, as objectors, you'd identified. What were those issues?
So we said that because it's on the bottom of a very steep hill, a big moor, that any water off the construction site would end up in the stream and the ancient woodland, and lo and behold, it has. And we've reported them to the Environment Agency a number of times, who are constantly out checking water quality, and they have to, well, they've had to put silt traps up, filters, and all sorts. So okay. So that came true.
So this was the rainwater runoff, basically, and they hadn't proposed attenuation tanks or suds or anything like that. It was just straight runoff.
There was no surface water management. They said that there was enough clear area on the side of the site that would soak the water up, and lo and behold, it didn't, and it ran all over the roads and all over the footpaths and all in the woodland and all into the stream.
Okay, so what other issues apart from drainage did you identify?
So we had another one where they very unusual site in that they put I don't know if people know the Harris fencing, so the clear fencing that stands in the rubber blocks. They enclosed the site in Harris fencing, and all the time it was forever blowing down and causing obstructions of footpaths. And they did an awful job maintaining it. So we reported them to the Health and Safety Executive, who also warned them that they had to be more careful and take more care of the public, really.
And did you get the result? Did the fencing then stay upright?
Oh yes, yeah, it was all tied on then. Yes.
Despite the Sheffield and Barnsley winds. Despite
the Sheffield and Barnsley winds, yes.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so this site went through an appeal. What was the difference between the planning committee, where you got refusal based on no doubt some very good objections and reasons for refusal, and the inspector granting permission? What was the difference?
The council brought up, one of the key issues they brought up was traffic. And the planning committee refused it on traffic volumes, and also on density of dwellings.
Okay.
The planning inspector said actually he didn't believe, having read the developer's traffic report, there was no issue. Okay. And also that the dwellings, because of the topography of the site, was acceptable. But what he failed to realise was that the site was on a slope like this, with the top of the moor, very big moor. They basically cut cut the wedge out, the bottom of the wedge. So they've created a very big swimming pool. I imagine they've used canoes today, to be honest, but a very big swimming pool at the bottom of that moor. And the developers, the planning inspector said he didn't realise that, and he said the density was fine. So obviously it's 4 and 5 bed houses that have gone on.
Yeah, well, there's a surprise, isn't it? Yeah, which that's a different webinar.
Yes.
But I think the issue is there. I think something a lot of the people on this call, and I know a lot of the campaigns, the 600 plus campaigns in the CPA have experienced, where they may get the support of their local planning committee, and then the national inspector reverses that decision.
Absolutely. I mean, some of the key things, you know, to pass on to people, really, for me. I mean, for say people in Barnsley and the coal authority really are your friend. I mean, the developer sent in a geotechnical report that pointed out that there was coal, 2 seams of coal actually underneath this site. Everybody ignored it. The planning officer actually ignored it and said there was no issue. And then when they started cutting the wedge off, lo and behold, they uncovered the coal. And then they started, oh God, you couldn't write this stuff. They started loading it into lorries, and we videoed them doing it. All the coal, and above and below coal is something called fire clay. It's bright yellow, can't build on it. They were loading it all into big dumper lorries, and then taking it off site and illegally tipping it into a farm in Conisborough, which is probably about 15-20 miles away from where we live. We followed the lorry. Unfortunately, they got wind of it. So when the Environment Agency, we'd reported it to the Environment Agency, they got wind of it, and they stopped. So they had to prove it was leaving, although they could see that the material had been tipped. They had to prove it had left site and arrived there. So the Environment Agency didn't pursue that, but it stopped them tipping it. And actually, there is a big pile of coal come awful material at the back of the site that they're still to get rid of. But they needed a coal mining licence and a coal removing licence to touch that coal. It belongs to the Crown, and they hadn't done that. So we reported them to the Coal Authority, and they stopped them working until that had been in place.
Do you know if any further action is being taken by the National Coal Board on that?
No, they got their licence to remove the coal eventually, and obviously now they're all above board. So, but I think for every tonne that's removed, regardless of who it's used, the Coal Authority receive a payment. So
So you've got an open cast coal mine in Yorkshire now.
We have, another one. Yeah.
Okay. I'm very conscious. That's about 13 minutes. Just a couple of more questions, and then Daniel will come to you. Something we'll come to later, and I just noticed somebody asked a question about it, so we won't cover it now, is to say conditions. And if you can think about conditions, and we'll come back to that after Daniel's spoken about that. You talked about the environmental landscape value and the ancient woodland. Who did that work? And is it a formal designation? How did you do that?
Right, so for the ancient woodland, we're a bit strange here in Sheffield. We were in Derbyshire, and then we got moved into Sheffield. So all our ancient records are at Matlock Records Office. So before COVID, we went to the records office, and we looked for all the maps for this area, all the ancient maps, and because it's a small woodland, it wasn't shown on this particular map. It was because the clarity of it wasn't quite clear enough. But we also surveyed all the flora and in the wood, because an ancient wood isn't just about the trees; it's also about the ground flora. So we mapped. And
was that a third party? Was that a third party external consultant that did that surveying for you?
No, we did.
So you were allowed to do your own surveying, and they took that as evidence.
Yeah. We photographs. I'll say to everybody, photographs and GPS and logs. And we submitted. Sandra, a colleague of mine, she submitted all the information, all the old maps, current plans. And obviously we'd been measuring the trees, and we had them on the ancient tree inventory, from the Woodland Trust. That's hard to say.
I'm going to say, try saying that in a couple of hours.
I know. And yes, we put that on. We submitted that, and they granted the ancient woodland status. So
Right.
that was good. And the wildlife site, same thing really. With the Wildlife Trust, we collected the data, they assessed it, and it met the criteria, local criteria. Okay. So
fantastic. Right. So to summarise, you didn't give up. You did an enormous amount of evidence collecting. You went to agencies outside of the council, although you have, I understand you said, got a reasonable relationship with their enforcement compliance department, not necessarily with the councillor, not necessarily with other officers, the planning officer. Your MP was supportive, which I think helps, although sometimes they're as much use as a chocolate teapot, quite frankly.
I will say though, Simon, he actually supported building. But
really?
What he didn't accept was how appallingly badly the builder was behaving.
Well done. Okay, great. And the fact that it was highways, which is a county function, really, one of the key things. But you've got a whole list of other stuff that we can talk about. We'll talk about that later. But at all times, you were polite, respectful, objective. Didn't go into rants, didn't go into mass demonstrations, blaring horns, didn't get into civil disobedience, etc. You took them on at their own game. Yeah, evidence-based. Yeah. Fantastic. I'm sure more of that will come out as when we go to the questions later on. So Daniel, just let me load up your slides. Said he. There we go. Can you see those okay?
Yes. Thanks, Simon. And
over to you, Daniel.
Thanks so much, Simon. And Claire, just to follow up on what you said, it is so impressive to hear all the work that you have done there in Sheffield and how successfully it has paid off. You are an inspiration to all of us.
Thank you.
So that's just incredibly impressive. So North
and in Best Downing Street style, Daniel, when you want the next slide, all you have to say is next slide, please.
Okay, thanks, Simon. So Northstowe Newtown is in Cambridge, 5 miles to the northwest of Cambridge, and it is due to be the largest new town in the United Kingdom since Milton Keynes, with a population of 28,000 and 10,000 new dwellings. So what has gone wrong in Northstowe? Northstowe is adjacent to a village called Longstanton. And when development of the site commenced in 2015, all the ponds in the neighboring village went dry. And you can see this here in this photograph that's on the BBC website, showing one of the former ponds in Longstanton that has no water. And this is obviously a concern because wildlife needs water to survive. And this has interfered with the ecology of a very wide area of this part of Cambridgeshire. The matter has never been adequately assessed. And so that's the underlying issue that our group is especially concerned about. Where is the development now in the approval process? So at present, all 10,000 houses have been granted outline planning approval. Can we have the next slide, please, Simon? So where are we now in the planning approvals process? We have planning permission granted for 10,000 houses, and we have judicial review proceedings underway challenging the final permission for 4,000 of those houses on a number of grounds. And environmental impacts for EIA development are obviously regulated under the EIA regulations. And the Schedule 4 details the information that has to be included in environmental impact assessments. And this is a really key legislation that I would really encourage all campaign groups to become familiar with, because the Schedule 4 sets out in fairly precise terms the information that has to be included. And it's a very comprehensive list. And councils have wide discretion as to what information they require. But if you get started in the process early enough, you can probably influence them to include the matters you're concerned about in the EIA assessment. And in regards to the development of Northstowe, we asked for the significant impacts of the development in regards to cumulative effects on water and groundwater to be included in the EIA. The local planning authority refused to do this. They said the effects were not significant, and on that basis, they declined to consider them in the EIA process. Next slide, please, Simon. So the council broke the law and granted permission for 4,000 houses in violation of their own planning policies and in violation of the EIA regulations. And so we've commenced judicial review proceedings, which are currently pending now in the High Court. And we successfully funded those through crowdfunding, and that's been fantastic. But as this process has continued, some very concerning information has come to light. Next slide, please, Simon. And the evidence that's come out in the process has not really reflected very well on the local planning authority. So much to the local planning authority's credit, they did spend £10,000 of public funds for an environmental report on the groundwater issues we had raised. But then the local planning authority, their reports misstated the public authority that had actually acted as client. So what the local planning authority did was they commissioned reports, which they controlled behind the scenes, but they purportedly, where they stated that the parish council was responsible for these reports, when in fact that was not the case. And you might wonder, what harm does this do? What authority was responsible for the production of the report? Well, it matters because the planning committee was unaware that the local planning authority's officers had been manipulating this environmental assessment behind the scenes. And that's very concerning because the members of our local planning committee do a lot of work and try to make the best decisions they can. And they rely on officers to give them honest and accurate information. And when it turns out that that's not the case, that really undermines the integrity of the entire planning process. And that's very corrosive and disruptive to public trust. And it's just not good for local democracy. So that's where we are now. We're supposed to be in the High Court in 2 weeks' time. I'm happy to take any questions. So that's North Stowe.
Fantastic, Daniel. Thank you very much indeed. I'm just gonna stop sharing. There we go. We're all back together again. Well, I mean, this is very much a very specific set of circumstances. A massive new town. I mean, 10,000 dwellings. That is enormous. And I think very few of our campaigns are involved with that size, although I know there are some. But I think the important thing also is that you mentioned the EIA. I mean, one of the areas that we come up against time and time again is when councils say, oh, it's below the threshold. I can't remember if it's numbers or land area. We don't need to do an EIA. And they're actually impacting on grade 1 or 2 farmland or highly water meadows, woodland, whatever it may be. So, but you had the EIA, they accepted they had to do it, although the incredibly frustrating thing that they didn't accept that the water loss was going to be an issue. I mean, what's been the reaction when you've gone back with the evidence to say to the council, you've got this wrong, guys, stick your hand up?
Well, the council can't respond to the evidence. They have no argument. They have no way to defend their decision. So they've refused to engage with us in any way. And in the High Court proceedings, they have basically withheld the evidence that we needed to argue our claim. So it's been very frustrating to have seen us raise £30,000 and then to waste that on legal proceedings where the council has actively deceived the court. It's incredibly disappointing. I mean, the one point I will make is that local planning authorities do have wide discretion to determine when an environmental impact assessment is necessary.
Yep.
And this goes back to something Claire said earlier about evidence. Collecting that evidence early in the process and getting it well documented and put together in a form that the council can consider easily is probably the best defense against a council avoiding an EIA when they should have one.
Okay, so Daniel, what was the process in terms of how you all raised this with both councils, with the parish council and with the local planning authority council?
Yeah, so
what reactions did you get?
residents started raising the concerns 7 years ago, and the parish council has been supportive, and the parish council raised this issue with the district council, and they acknowledged there was a concern. But I think what the district council, the local planning authority, has done that's been so harmful to the process is that they've tried to not deal with this issue in the planning decision-making process. And that's what's been so corrosive to public trust. You know, we realize the district council could have said, yes, the development is causing water loss, but we're going to make a balance of that against the benefit provided by 10,000 homes. And if they had just said that that was their political assessment, local people would have accepted that. But by hiding evidence from the planning committee about the groundwater impacts, people just feel that they've been deprived of a fair decision-making process.
Yeah. So you know, the outcome of this is that basically the majority of the groundwater ponds and streams have just dried up.
Yes, that's right. There is no water left, and we know this because the developer has done surveys in 2020, and the aquifer is dry, completely dry. It has been destroyed by the development.
Okay. So have you looked at alternative, as in Claire's case, looked at alternative agencies that you can go to?
Yes, so the Environment Agency is in a very difficult position here, because I think the Environment Agency would like to take more aggressive enforcement action, but I think the Environment Agency doesn't feel they have the necessary political support to do so from the government.
Right.
So the Environment Agency seems to be in a bad position of realizing that serious environmental damage has been done, but I think they feel slightly powerless to take action without political support.
So here you have a situation where you've got the evidence. Well, sorry, you haven't got the council's evidence because they wouldn't produce it for the judicial review, but you've got your own evidence. You've actually got a legal case, because there's no way that a barrister would take that on without it being a case, and it wouldn't have been accepted for judicial review. So, but then the agency involved cannot take action, or isn't willing to take action, if I understand what you were saying, because of the lack of political will and support behind that. So have you raised this with your MP?
Yes, we have. Our MP was actually very supportive at first, and actually set up a meeting for us with the Environment Agency on the site to look at the actual implications of the problem. But he's concerned about saving his seat in the next election, and I think he is more focused on his practical political concerns than the long-time environmental integrity of the area. So he has not been as supportive lately. And that's disappointing.
Okay, well, I'm sure you might say that, Daniel. I certainly wouldn't wish to comment.
Yes, absolutely.
No, I mean, unfortunately, they blow in which way the wind is blowing. They go with the wind at a certain time. I mentioned conditions earlier, and I know you and I communicated about conditions. I mean, could you just generally talk about the need to get conditions done at the application stage prior to planning committee, prior to any appeal?
Yes, so conditions are really, in my view, the most important part of the planning process, because once a site gets allocated for development, or once it gets approved for whatever reason, the development most likely is going to happen. Conditions give you a way to make sure that the development is broadly acceptable in planning terms. And this can relate to all kinds of impacts, from traffic to flooding to ecology. I mean, literally anything that relates to planning and the land in question can be controlled under a planning condition. It's just an incredibly important part of the process. And this doesn't stop. I mean, this is when a planning campaign really needs to get going, is once the application is issued, because councils have very wide discretion as to whether or not to discharge planning conditions and whether or not to allow conditional approvals to go ahead. So you really have a second bite at the cherry here. And depending on which way the political winds blow, councils can sometimes actually really enforce the conditions in rigorous ways, and that really can mitigate negative outcomes for communities.
Right. Thank you, Daniel. You've anticipated my next question, which is the other side of the coin. So, Claire, all these wonderful conditions that are put in, and some of them by the officers up front, some of them are standard, some of them are raised by the district or borough councillor or parish council, town council put in. A few of them come in maybe from residents groups, but not all the ones that the residents want are in there. But they're there. And if you're lucky, if it goes to appeal as well, the inspector will stick with them. So, of course, all of those conditions, they do all the work necessary, they do all the documentation necessary, they discharge all those conditions, everything is done by the book. Is that what happens?
No, you knew that I was going to say that, didn't you? Yeah, I mean, our conditions, we had a meeting at the public inquiry, and we put forward, we were told if we lost, what conditions would we like to see? And we put those forward, and we got some of them. We didn't get all of them, but we got some of them. So you're right that the developer puts in the conditions. A lot of it is just churning out the same stuff. But the devil is in the detail, and for most developments, the developer has to put together what's called a construction environmental management plan, a SEMP. And it's very important that you read all these documents, and the same with arboricultural reports, all these things, because I say the devil is in the detail, and our developer, because he didn't comply with what he said he would do in his construction management plan, ended up with an enforcement notice because we monitored what he was doing and reported it to the council numerous times, and then in the end they just said, you either put it right or we're putting an enforcement notice on you, and they did. So the conditions, as I said, are very important, and to go along with that as well, which I should have said earlier, is the Section 106 payments. So in conjunction with getting planning permission, they normally agree the legal document, the Section 106, which sets out how the developer is going to pay money to the council for different things. So in our case, there was biodiversity net gain, there was some improvements to the tram stop, some lighting, some litter bins, protection of the ancient wood, some fencing, and it's important that you read all those documents and make notes, because you can hold the developer to account with the council. Our council, as all councils, are very busy, and they can't monitor everything 24/7. So it really is down to you guys to read those documents and hold these people to account. I mean, I'll give you another example of what happened at Owlthorpe. Is that they were building.
Sorry, Claire, just before you go on to the next example, just to reinforce the point, but doing that information feedback and communication to the council in that same polite, respectful, evidence-based way.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's an attenuation pond that they're building, and they did it the first time. They've had to build it twice. They did it the first time. It didn't match the plans in any way, shape, or form. I mean, it was so far removed, and they'd have got away with it had we not been there. And we said to the council, here is what got approved. Here is what is built. The two really don't match, and they've made them redo it again properly.
Right, but you don't think the council would have done that without you raising it with them?
No, because they're stretched. They've got a lack of resource. Sure. They're very stretched. So it is down to you guys to monitor the plans as well.
Let me put a question to both of you, and go to Daniel first. So in a wonderful world, these conditions are there. If the developer doesn't fulfil them or contravenes them, you hopefully the councils pick it up, but they won't always. From what Claire quite rightly says, they're under resourced, they're time stretched. But you politely, respectfully, objectively, and compliance go in, but the council just says no. And the next thing you have is discussions about brown envelopes and special relationships and blah, blah, blah. I've seen it so many times. Sometimes it's down to pure incompetence by the compliance and enforcement officers. Other times it's should we say dubious what's been done, or they've conceded and they've said they'll meet them halfway. What's been your experience of that, Daniel?
It's been mixed. I mean, first of all, local planning authorities have certain legal obligations they have to fulfill when considering and planning enforcement of planning conditions. And the first is that the meaning of the interpretation, the meaning of the planning condition is dependent on the words, and they have to correctly apprehend what the condition means before they can make an informed decision about whether or not to enforce it. And in our experience, if you can get councils to actually grapple with the reasons for the condition and the actual words of the condition, you can usually convince officers to reach a reasonable decision on whether or not enforcement action.
And on that one, Daniel, because I've been there, I've done this, is there'll just be a standard list of conditions, and the officers then are asked by councillors to put in extra conditions, and they make up the wording on the spot, and it gets put into the decision, and that's it, because it has to be done at committee. So would you advise residents groups and parish councils, town councils, to send a list of conditions in prior to the application and prior to the committee? Come to you in a second, Claire.
Adam?
That's the way to do it, is it?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
When you're in this position, the stance we've taken is you've got nothing to lose, right? It's always been, if you don't ask, you don't get. What do you lose by asking? So ask for the earth, and if you get the moon, then you've got small wins. Take the small wins. It's all about little wins.
Okay. All right. That is absolutely fascinating.
If I can just
so far,
on that
I'm going to ask. Sorry, say again, Daniel.
If I can just follow up on that point briefly.
Please do.
The wording of conditions is very important, and I think it's always beneficial for groups to actually propose the wording of planning conditions themselves. And if you're going to seek advice from a barrister or planning consultant, this is the point where you want to spend your money on professional advice, because getting professional advice on getting those planning conditions correctly formulated can be the difference between mitigating serious impacts and not mitigating them.
Yeah, really, really good point, Daniel. I mean, and one of the things I'll throw in here, and I know this is something Rosie's very supportive of as well. You will be, anyone who goes to use a barrister or even a consultant for an application prior to committee, or particularly before an appeal, or certainly before a judicial review, you are paying by the minute. You do not want to have niceties and small talk with a barrister. You need to go in with a very clear list of what you want to discuss, and you as a group have discussed it, debated it beforehand. So you go in with, shall we say, 8 bullet points, and you're asking for their opinion. And likewise, if you're asking for written opinion from a barrister, the brief should be incredibly tight, because the more they spin it out, the more it costs you.
I mean, that's
okay. So
right.
So out of your experiences, what can resident campaign groups do to fill in the gap where the planning system is obviously so disconnected in some cases? What are the two main things that you think a residents campaign group who's faced with an application or faced with an appeal, what should they be looking to do? On the basis that the application, you know, the title of the webinar, the application is going to go through, so they're going to get permission. What are the 2 key things they need to think about?
Familiarise yourself with all the documents that have been submitted, and as with any developer, they'll put in revision after revision after revision. So I always keep a folder on my laptop with the latest revision, and then when planning is granted, that will inevitably say what versions of the drawings have been approved. And it's worth, so when you see new drawings on the planning portal, you know, refer that back, and you've just got to check documents and check drawings, and check the planning portal all the time, because even after planning permission is granted, the conditions will be discharged. Our planning authority let us comment on the conditions, and they actually listened to what we had to say, you know, and the documents are uploaded and plans are changed all the time. You have a right to comment on them. You've got to keep watch. Your work doesn't stop.
Just to you in a second, Daniel. I mean, the one I always love is it's the non-material pre-decision amendment. I mean, I've never heard such a complete, total nonsense. You know, every amendment is potentially material. So,
yeah, I
Daniel.
mean, I was good. Can I just quickly say on that? I mean, our developer, he chopped down and it took 5 meters extra than his land, chopped down all the trees in it, and we reported it to the council. And fair play to them. They've said actually it's not a non-material amendment. You've made a right boo-boo, and we want a new planning application, and that is currently going through at the moment. They've had to submit a new planning application because the change was so vast. And they're making them replant. I know it's no consolation, but they're replanting on a 3-to-1 basis now.
Well, I think the consolation in that, Claire, is that one, they've had to go through the cost of putting in a new application. It's not the cost of the application, it's the cost of the consultants and time, you know, their businesses. And secondly, the fact that they've had to go through the cost of doing the replanting. Yeah, so Daniel, over to you. So, you know, one, or if you've got them, two main things that you would be looking to do with all that experience now in retrospect.
That's a good question. I mean, the first thing is recognize that planning decisions are inherently political by nature, and start building your political support as early as possible, because these are all discretionary decisions. And having those relationships with councillors can make a big impact on how they consider it. And then the second thing is almost opposite. Look at the details of the application, because that's where you're going to find things that can actually stop that particular application, or find things that you can control by condition. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Daniel. I'm now going to switch over to the questions, and there's quite a few in here. So we're going to go through this as like a quick fire round, Claire, Dan. First one from Emma, and we've dealt with one of these already. But what are the type of thing that the developer hasn't complied with conditions on? So let's forget the construction management, transport management part of it. What are the other things that you've come across where they haven't complied?
For me, obviously, groundwater pollution, failure to control emissions from site. Then they've gone beyond their red line boundary and chopped down trees that they shouldn't have done. They've actually chopped down part of an ancient hedgerow that they shouldn't have done. But we're making, obviously, now we've brought that up, and it's they've had to put it right. So
great,
thank you,
Daniel.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, cool. I mean, I would also say they don't fulfill the landscape plan in its entirety. They don't water the trees that they've put in, and over the last couple of summers they don't finish the children's playground that they were meant to do. Maybe they were meant to put a community building up, so they put the building up with just the brickwork and the breeze blocks, but they don't plaster it or put any power or water in, and so on and so forth. So Amelia is asking, do planning conditions become legally binding at the planning committee hearing? My understanding is that they don't become binding until the decision notice is issued.
That's my understanding.
Okay, so there you go, Amelia. Claire and I both agree on that. Daniel does too, so there we go. Right, so if PINs, so the planning inspectorate, grant on are any attached automatically delegated to officers, or can they be called into councillors to determine at a meeting? That's a good question.
I can only give you my experience. Was that there was when it went to planning committee, there were a list of conditions attached to the the report, and when it went to PINs, PINs went through those conditions and asked us if we wanted any further conditions. What if planning was granted, because you have to assume it's granted, they do, so that everything is in place. What would we want? So for instance, that's the time to ask for planting, for bird boxes, hedgehog boxes, as much mitigation as you can possibly get through to speak up at that point.
Absolutely. Daniel.
Yeah, so when the planning inspector grants permission, the conditions that are attached are a matter for the planning inspector. But if there are any conditions that require the further submission of information or further approvals, those go back to the local planning authority. And whether those applications are determined by councillors or by officers is a matter for the scheme of delegation for each individual local planning authority.
Thank you. That's really useful, Daniel. I mean, I can only go by my experience. The discharge of the conditions is the responsibility of the officers. I haven't seen any called in by councillors after an inspector has granted permission. I have seen, however, an inspector add conditions at the request of an extremely aggressive district councillor. I'm referring to my wife, because basically the developer was getting away with too much, and she got 2 very expensive conditions regarding road crossings put in, which the developer tried to fudge, and the inspector said no, they're going through, which was good. But no, I don't think it does go back to doesn't go back to councillors. Oh wow, how do you keep up interest and impetus locally, from Andrea? Daniel.
Oh, sorry.
Just breaking with the routine, Claire. Daniel.
This is a good question, and I don't have a good answer to this one, so I'll listen to what Claire says.
It's very hard. It's a simple answer to that. I think Daniel will maybe agree with that. When planning is granted, there ends up being a lot of apathy, and people kind of say, what's the point? But we had a really good, Owlthorpe Fields Action Group. There's a really good group of people, and we all stuck together, and we buoyed each other up when somebody was down, and we had regular meetings, and we still have regular meetings now. And we kind of decided, well, until they leave site, we're gonna keep on at them. And I know this sounds really awful, but when planning was granted and they kind of cheated their way to get planning permission with the planning inspectorate, we were a bit bitter about it, I'll be honest. And we said we'll set out to make life as difficult as possible for them. And I would say that we've achieved that. And actually, they have done a lot of that by themselves Good. As well. So.
That's really great, Claire. I mean, I think 2 other points I'd add to that is, one, everything you do costs them time and money. And the second thing is what we did in a couple of our local resident groups is, originally, of course, it's the people that surround the site or are next to the site or are affected by it. But as the houses are built out, add to the residents that move in, because lo and behold, and I can say this because it's been in the national press, Persimmon don't attach the gable ends of houses. They don't put in the roof fire connections. They don't connect showers. They put in old boilers, etc., etc. So suddenly you've got a whole new group of people who ridiculously can't do much about it through the National House Building certification, but they then join the local residents group. And actually what that and the cost of money last time, you become a pain, and developers will look elsewhere. They'll look for softer targets. So you just need force of character, Andrea, to keep going and recruit more new people. Never give up.
And I just add to that, you're very true in what you say, because we now have liaison meetings with the site manager, and he said that even if the other 2 plots hadn't been saved, Avant Homes, they ignore that. They wouldn't have considered buying them anyway after the experience they've had here.
Right, Claire, very, very quickly, S106 and Bionet gain payments.
Yeah, I touched on it earlier. It's very important that you read and familiarise yourselves, because, and have a voice with the council. We've written to our council and say we want to be involved in the net gain payments and where it's spent. It's affecting where we live. And the same with the Section 106 payments. I mean, they want to put lights on a back corridor and, those kind of things. You can still influence and make a difference. So it is important to pick up on those kind of documents.
And when you say you are a resident campaigning association, you have a constitution, you take minutes, you have officers, and Daniel, I know you've gone into you're a consortium and you're a lot more professional than just a casual group of residents. I mean, that's important, isn't it, to get that credibility?
Yeah, I think it is absolutely. And it also gives you democratic legitimacy, which political decision makers like to see, that you are representing the interests of the wider community.
Yeah, absolutely. One from Emma here. It seems developers can get officer decisions that an EIA, an environmental impact assessment, isn't needed. How can this be challenged? Any ideas?
It's not necessarily easy to challenge a decision not to have an EIA, because the EIA regulations are subject to what's called an irrationality test. And so the decision has to be very, very wrong before the court will take action. But if it is very, very wrong, there are legal remedies.
Yeah, absolutely, Daniel. And I've been through one of these in a local site here that actually was the grounds of Trelawn's Hospital, which was a famous hospital from the First World War. And there was no EIA. And it took a very strong representation for a residents group. And it was pure political will that got the officers to accept an EIA was required, which went all the way up to leader of the council to make it happen. It can be done, but it's blooming hard work, I can tell you. So just thank you to Mark for answering Amelia's question. And I'm moving down. Yeah, this is Amelia again, saying, I think local authorities seem to vary greatly. Absolutely, Amelia, as to how much due diligence they do when assessing applications. I think they vary between applications as well, quite frankly. The local authority in my area does hardly anything. Yeah, I mean, I think we've all three of us have got the same experience there, haven't we?
You've just got to be persistent. Is the only advice I can give to you on that is be persistent, but be polite, and just keep providing the evidence. And you've got to be, with these things, you've got to be tenacious, right? It took us 4 or 5 months before the council acted and put the enforcement notice on. You've just got to be persistent with it.
Yeah, but again, Claire, I repeat the point: politely, you know, objectively, with evidence, but robustly.
Yes.
And I think part of that is trying to get your local councillors on side. And particularly at the moment, local councillors will be very helpful, because in many cases they have an election coming up next May. In some areas, not everywhere, and that would be the district or borough councillors. County councillors often have a different cycle, but that's the key.
And it's worth copying in your MP as well.
Yeah. Well,
if your MP is supportive. Yeah. It
seems to me, I mean, Rosie and I had an email exchange on this the other day. I mean, we're beginning to get quite a few MPs. You know, Roger Gale, the Isle of Wight MP, Maria Caulfield in Lewes in Sussex, Peter Bottomley, another one in Sussex. I think the sewage into the sea, the lack of water supply, environmental impacts. I think some of the MPs are actually beginning to realise what's going on, and so I think we need to keep that up. I mean, Daniel, is that your experience?
Yes, I mean, listen, these issues that are local concerns are gaining national political attraction because they're affecting so many communities. I do think we're on the right track nationally in regards to planning issues, but I think it will take quite some time before a greater awareness of planning issues kind of filters through to local government.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on to one now from Sol. Lovely to have you on here, Sol. I know we've communicated online on the Facebook site. In Sol saying, in our case, the site is part of the Garden Communities programme within the underground protection zone. During the consultation, the site was the council's preferred option. The questions were raised by the residents group about the ground. And and then that stops. I'm sorry, we haven't got the rest of it, but basically, I think that's saying that, you know, the council wanted to use that site, the residents raised it, and it sounds as though it was at least questioned. I don't know what the result was. Maybe, Sol, if you could put a quick note in the chat just to tell us what actually finally happened. But I think it shows that, you know, and I know Sol and the residents down there put a lot of work in. This is a good question. Are there any consequences for a council which grants permission for a scheme when local objectives highlighted issues, noise, ecological loss, water runoff? What comeback do local residents have? Well, Daniel, you're the person to answer that one because it's a J and an R, isn't it?
Well, yes, and I mean, in regards to any particular decision, yes, you have no recourse except through judicial review, which is expensive and difficult. Like I said, all planning decisions are political decisions, and the ultimate recourse is through the democratic process. So if we elect better councillors who take more account of residents' concerns, we can influence the system to get better quality decisions.
Thank you, Daniel. So, okay, Sal's saying, ignore my comment. We will. The prolific Amelia with another one. What happens when the local authority ignores a condition that was requested by the committee and agreed to by the council? So I'm assuming at the planning committee. The condition was requested before the vote. Without the condition having been agreed, the development may not have been approved. The committee hearing was recorded and we have the transcript. I'm afraid my answer to that was the only thing you can do is judicial review on that. And because it's a process, judicial reviews can only be taken against legality and process and soundness of the decision. You can't actually question the actual decision itself. You question the legality, soundness and process. That's process. JR is the only thing you can do, and that's expensive. Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, everything you said there was correct. But in this instance, so the decision notice is the legally binding form of the decision, but the decision itself was what was voted on by the planning committee. So if the decision notice does not reflect what was actually agreed at the planning committee, that makes the decision notice illegal. Now, the decision notice is presumed to be valid unless it's quashed by the High Court. So again, your only recourse is judicial review, and you have to start proceedings within 6 weeks of the date of the decision notice.
Right. I mean, thank you to many of you who are actually putting answers in here as well. And I think this is demonstrating the power of CPA, where we've got over 600 campaigns, all with enormous amounts of experience, some with very little experience and just starting the journey. But by sharing, we're really helping each other. Mel Boyle has posted something here, which I think is interesting, just to raise this. Our council is the landowner. They're the planning approver. They're the developer. I'm assuming they have a building company shelled out from the council, and even has estate agents as councillors. And they're looking at 4,000 to 7,500 houses on farmland. There won't be an update now until December the 13th. It's been to judicial review, but they haven't as yet. They've applied for it, but they have not confirmed if they can appeal. Homes England, right, and they're selling that as a bypass, not mentioning the houses. It's this shows the level of complexity and in many cases opaqueness around which. And if I remember correctly, Mel, I think this might be the Chippenham area. Sorry if I'm wrong, but this just shows the opaqueness around the planning process. It really, you do need to dive in to get the detail, and sometimes you can't get it. And any comments, Claire?
Yes, sorry, mine's gone blank. I was going to say something then. Just carry on a minute. It'll come back to me. Yeah. Sorry,
Daniel. Anything to add to that? To comment on that?
I mean, so one of the strategies that local planning authorities like to use is to just draw out the process for as long as possible to exhaust your resources in terms of people's energy and your financial resources. So most of the struggle is keeping the campaign going for longer than the council is willing to put up with you. So just persistence will pay off, and it sounds like this is a relatively persistent group. So I would just encourage you to keep going and keep insisting that the decision is carried out fairly and properly.
And
sorry,
Claire, go for it.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that what we discovered was social media and getting your name out there actually was really important. So joining CPA Twitter accounts, Facebook accounts, getting local people people, you know, like in your city, local area, county, you know, nationwide, get your name out there. Make sure that you're you know, people know about you, because that'll put the scares on the council.
Absolutely, but do that
politely,
with respect, objectively, but robustly.
Yeah. And no obviously slagging anybody off.
Absolutely. But the one thing I would stress to everybody is make sure you brand the Residents Association, the Residents Campaign properly, and respect that branding, because that's what gives you credibility. If you're, you know, the dreadful term of NIMBYs, and I'm afraid too many resident campaigns shoot themselves in the foot, either by being single issue, which is not materially planning relevant, or they go off on rants, they have demonstrations at the council offices, they throw eggs or whatever it might be. As soon as you do that, you've lost all credibility. The council will just shut you off. Anyway, I'm afraid I can't continue with the questions. We've reached 6:30, and thank you to, I mean, there are a few more here. Thank you so much, everybody. Yep, Sir Roger Gale is MP for North Thanet. Indeed he is, John, and he's been a great supporter of both the local campaign groups and also in contact with the CPA, along with people like Clive Betts, who's been wonderful. Thank you very much indeed to Claire and Daniel for sharing your experiences and more. I found that an absolutely fascinating hour.
I hope others, I hope people have found it useful. I said, you know, it's you just got to keep going.
Absolutely. And remember, it doesn't stop when the permission is granted. It doesn't stop when they put in the foundations. It doesn't stop when they're building. And it doesn't stop even when the first people move in. Keep it going. Rosie, over to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, what can I add? Simon, beautifully chaired. Thank you. That was really interesting having your insights as well. And Claire and Daniel, thank you so much for coming on, giving up your time and sharing everything that you've done and been through. I thought it was both depressing not to hear you speak, but to hear what the developers get up to, and inspiring to hear what you've both done and achieved. And yeah, very much take from that it's the same as campaigning before the planning permission, isn't it? It's persistence, politeness and evidence. If we stick to those the whole time, then you can win, and even at this latter stage you can make a difference. So thank you very much. That was brilliant. Very, very useful. Oh, look, Simon.
The webinar has been recorded in answer to the question that somebody's just asked, and will be on the CPA website. Actually,
sorry, the CPA YouTube channel, which
sorry, do beg your pardon.
That's all right. We'll put it on the Facebook group tomorrow and on Twitter once it's up, or once it's up there. So keep an eye out for that.
And Rosie, can I just say, if people have got some questions, you know, if I can help them, obviously, if they email, obviously CPA, pass them on to me, and I'll do my best to answer them and, you know, give advice.
That's brilliant. And good luck with the rest of it, you two as well. I mean, Daniel's got 2 big weeks ahead with court cases, so yeah, good luck and thank you.
Good luck, everybody, and good luck to all of you out there with your campaigns.
Agreed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Goodbye.